Okay, Alex, if you want to start off.
Hi, good afternoon. We're so excited to have a guest here with us today at our sociology graduate colloquium. This is someone that Dr. Dahms and Dr. Chien-fei Chen brought to our attention for this special lecture. Normally the department puts on colloquiums to bring information and new ideas into the department that we can all benefit from. So if anyone in sociology has any request in regards to colloquium, Zaina, who's not here with us today, but is normally, or I would love to hear them. And we're so proud to put this on. Dr. Dahms will now introduce our guest.
Okay, so I'm Harry Dahms. I'm a faculty member in sociology. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Social Justice. And as one of the current co-directors of the Center for Social Justice, I'm pleased to announce this event relating to the R. Scott Frey Memorial Lecture. We are planning to make this an annual event, so we're working on an endowment. Scott Frey was, as the department head at the time, the co-founder of the Center for the Study of Social Justice with Stephanie Bohan, who is present and who continues to function as an associate director of the center. I don't need to say anything else really, so I'll move the floor over to Chien-fei Chen, who is the other co-director, who will introduce the speaker directly. So please take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm Chien-fei Chen. I'm the co-director of the center, and I'm going to jump in to introduce our speaker today. Professor Tom Dietz is a human ecologist and environmental sociologist. His research focuses on the driver of environmental change and human well-being, on the social psychology of the environmental decision-making, and on the interplay between science and values in direction of decision-making. He was funding director of the environmental science and policy programs at Michigan State University, and remains active there in the animal studies program and at the Center for the System Integration and Sustainability. Professor Dietz has served as the chair of the U.S. National Research Council Committee on Human Dimension of Global Change, and as vice chair of the Committee on Advancing the Science of Climate Change. He is a fellow of American Association for the Advance of Science, and has won many research awards from American Sociological Association section on environment and on animals and society. In 2017, he delivered the Mitchell Lecture on Sustainability at the University of Maine. Also in 2017, he was named University Distinguished Professor at MSU. He is currently an affiliate of the Gant Institute of Environment at the University of Vermont. And I ask him something besides academic, something more interesting about him. First of all, I want to go to the animal because I also like dogs. So he is very attached to his dogs. Currently, his name is Ben, and named after Ben Franklin, and I really would like to meet him because he sounds very smart. The other thing is Tom really enjoys all kinds of music, was a co-founder of the Camp Folk Festival for many years, and that had was his first show in 1971. And then he is also involved with local legal co-founders of Kent Legal Defense Fund and many other things. Let's welcome Professor Dietz to today's presentation.
Thank you. Let me make sure we get the screen share correct. Okay. Oops. There, so can everyone see the first slide? Is this working? The magic working okay?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, good. Well, I want to thank everyone for inviting me. This is really a special tribute. As we were talking just before everything started officially, Scott was a very important intellectual influence on me. He was a close collaborator for many years, and most important, he and Sally and Shay were friends and really an anchor for me when a bunch of us, the four of us, all had most of our life experience in relatively small towns, and we ended up in Washington, D.C. metro area at the same time. And so the personal connection there meant a lot as well. So it's really an honor, and I thank everybody for inviting me to do this. I'm going to talk about an aspect of Scott's work that is not as well known as some of the others, and it's about the intersection between ethics, policy, and sociology. And I'm going to try and focus on it from an environmental justice perspective. And throughout, I'll interject some pictures of Scott that Sally and Harry have been kind enough to provide me with. Whenever I give a talk, I usually like to make 3 points. The first, reflected in the first quote, is that probably most of what I said you've already heard before, but it's maybe worth repeating, maybe worth hearing it over again. The second is that I'm sure a lot of what I have to say will in the end be incorrect, but maybe it's useful to think through what's right and what's wrong, and maybe something can be learned from that. And the fourth, which is important when we get into realms of decision-making and policy, is while it's important to always focus on what's optimal, what would a utopian solution be, we also have to be careful not to let that block us from thinking about good, if not perfect solutions, that the best is the enemy of the good. So what I'm going to do is say just a few words about the emergence of environmental justice, because that helps sets the frame in which Scott did, and I and others did a lot of our work, sort of where we were historically when a lot of this work got started. And then talk overall about Scott's contributions. But I want to talk in particular today about his work in social impact assessment and its intersection with ethical theory, which is the contribution I think that is very important for sociology, but perhaps has not gotten as much attention as some of his other environmental justice work. There are 3 dominant ethical theories in policy analysis, and I'm just going to mention what those are because those are sort of, if you will, what we're up against as sociologists, although one of them is very much a sociological theory. Then I'm going to talk about the criteria that Scott offered for ethical theory, 2 criteria that are sort of ethical theories that can be applied in social impact assessment and other policy analysis that Scott suggested were good ways to go forward, and I think was correct in that. I'll very briefly mention some other criteria because I think it's important to have a diversity of criteria. And then in terms of the evolution of this kind of thinking, I'll talk about the relationship between diversity and deliberation, because deliberative processes in policy analysis is sort of where things have evolved since Scott's work on this area. Now, in terms of the history of environmental justice, and some of you know this history better than I do, but again, I'm trying to emphasize the context in which Scott was working. The key turning point is often Bob Bullard's work, and the first paper I'm aware of is the 1983 social inquiry paper. But there were predecessors to that Bob's work really set off a certain line of analysis that has been extremely important and influential. But there were things that were going on even before that 1983 paper. The first statement I know about environmental justice per se was by Nathan Hare, published in 1970. And I quote, I think this is the first line, quote, "The emergence of the concept of ecology in American life is potentially of momentous relevance to the ultimate liberation of Black people." Now, Hare went on to be very critical in that paper of the environmental movement's moderate at best engagement with liberation ideas. But nonetheless, it's a very important statement, understanding the potential of thinking about ecology and environmental issues in the context of Black liberation. And then the first sociological piece I know was a meeting paper in 1971 by Bill Birch, The Peregrine Falcon and the Urban Poor, where he talks about the relationships in ways that would be framed as environmental justice. But of course, the ideas of environmental justice really can be traced back further. There are really, in my view, 2 streams of environmentalism, at least in the US, but I think globally. One is the conservation movement, which involves the preservation of wilderness, but it's very problematically involved with settler colonialism. A lot of the first efforts at preservation were to ensure that white guys could go hunting the big game, that the big game would still be there. Indeed, Bob Brule argues that the first environmental organization in the US is the Boone and Crockett Club, which is very much focused on hunting. And in addition to that, the setting aside of natural areas, quote unquote, natural areas, usually ignored that the lands being set aside were sacred to inhabited by, and often shaped in terms of ecosystem management by indigenous people. It's perhaps no coincidence that the first government organization asked to manage the first national parks was the US Army, because the issue was controlling the folks who were already living in those areas. So it's an important movement. It's certainly been inspirational to a lot of us. I think there's a lot of good things in it, but we also have to acknowledge the sort of troubled history. And then there's the sort of health and pollution movement or movements. It's tied to the whole history of public health concerns, with longstanding concerns with inequity and injustice, and acknowledgement that health problems are often driven by environmental conditions and pollutions, and those are not equitably distributed. In the context where my thinking began and where Scott's thinking began, there had been a very strong and successful movement against nuclear fallout in the 1960s, coming from above ground nuclear testing, that sort of laid the groundwork for sort of a mass environmental movement in a lot of ways. And of course, a critical document that shows this confluence of conservation interests and health and pollution interests is Silent Spring, which really brings those things to the fore. I think it's also very evident in Earth Day, what happened on Earth Day 1970, the first Earth Day, which were a series of events centered on April 22nd, but that went several weeks before and after, and occurred all over the US. You see this convergence of the two streams of environmentalism and an emphasis on environmental justice. If you look back, many Earth Day events were in fact organized by communities of color to articulate their concerns about pollution and other sorts of issues in their community. And some of the leaders of the Environmental Teach-In Incorporated, which was the organization that coordinated the first Earth Day, and then became the Environmental Group of Environmental Action, were actually veterans of the civil rights and anti-war movement. So it's sort of no surprise that there was an environmental justice theme sort of in the air, even before some of the work that really shaped what we're doing now. And that's part of the background of Scott's work. Scott, of course, is probably best known for a series of papers, and I've listed some of them, not even all of them, that demonstrated how the global political economy visits risk of many different sorts, disproportionately on the least powerful. And one of the wonderful things about Scott's work is that he was always exploring a new risk, a new inequity, a new form of inequity generated by the global political economy. And I think David Pellow, in his tribute to Scott, says it best. This is actually the title of the tribute. Our Scott Frey was doing critical environmental justice long before anyone else. So that's probably Scott's best known work, but he did a lot of other innovative things. He was an innovator in articulating the importance of a risk perspective for understanding environmental justice and the implications of power. While formal risk analysis had been around for a long time, social sciences other than economics really first became involved in the 1980s as risk became much more important than environmental policy. And Scott moved from where we were at George Washington to the National Science Foundation and was involved in developing programs that eventually evolved into the ongoing, still very vibrant and strong decision, risk, and management science program at the National Science Foundation. So that program, in a sense, is part of his heritage because risk was just being explored as an idea that might be worthy of social science research and NSF funding when Scott went over to that program. His work on the High Plains Aquifer is really critical in terms of thinking about the sociology of water and water shortages. He was an amazingly interdisciplinary teacher. He did the first course of sociology through film that I'm aware of. He co-taught with Jonathan Moreno, a philosopher, a course on Dewey and Trotsky. And if you're curious as to why you would juxtapose Dewey and Trotsky, take a look at Dewey's biography. There's sort of an interesting connection that Scott taught me about there. I won't say more about it. And of course, as many of you know, he had a deep commitment to international engagement. His own work personally took him all over the world, often to places that were very difficult to engage with, but he was always generating events and linkages between wherever he was located institutionally in the United States and other institutions around the world. But today I'm going to focus on what I might call realizing the sociological imagination by exploring ethical stances in sociology. So again, the historical context, this is a graph of inequality. It's the share of income going to the top 1% of households in the United States. And you can see that something happens circa 1980. Something was going on that started in 1980. Now, Scott and I started our positions at George Washington University that year, and we had offices next to each other, and we became collaborators, good friends. As I mentioned before, really was embraced by Scott and Sally and Shay as a sort of an extension of their family. But I like to think that we weren't responsible for this change in inequality. It was something else that happened in Washington that year. Ronald Reagan was elected US president and invoked a lot of libertarian approaches to environmental and natural resource policies. And it was really a substantial change in how people thought about policies. It led to big changes in federal agencies and a rise of libertarianism as a serious part of the policy discourse. So Scott's work that I'm going to focus on was in the context of what was called social impact assessment, still is, and how ethical theory was necessary to do social impact assessment. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 called for the assessment of impacts of major government actions before a government agency could make a major decision, build a dam, give permits, enact a policy. It had to go through a systematic analysis and environmental impact assessment of what the implications would be. A series of court decisions clarified that the language in NEPA implied that that impact assessment included looking at social impacts, and that led to the emergence of this field of social impact assessment in sociology and kindred disciplines. And the goal was always to support the assessment of impacts in the policy process. The major school, probably the most prominent school or approach to SIA, was based on post hoc assessments of what had happened after, for example, an energy boomtown had developed, or a dam had been developed, or there had been changes in logging, federal logging policy in a community dependent on forest resources. Bill Freudenberg and Rich Kranick are among the prominent scholars who worked in this area. Because the projects they looked at were mostly in rural areas, this is an area of research strongly linked to community sociology. There was also some sociological engagement in modeling of impacts, but the problem with that is, as I put it, bad numbers drive out good paragraphs. There was a tendency with the impact assessment modeling there to model the things we knew how to model, so economic and demographic impacts and employment impacts, because we knew how to write code that would simulate those things. Things like changes in community character or even crime were not included in these impact modeling efforts because we just didn't know how to model those things. So this is where Scott, his mentor David Freeman, and a number of other collaborators came in, and I was also working along very parallel lines, which is one of the reasons Scott and I immediately resonated so much. They were arguing that if you wanted to do social impact assessment, or any really policy analysis or policy relevant work, you needed to think about ethical theory. What is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. In a sense, this is realizing the idea of troubles in the sociological imagination. For those of you who are not sociologists, I'll come to this in a second, what the sociological imagination is. So Scott and David, and I'll come to the details of what they said that if we're going to do this kind of work, you've got to have an ethical theory. Again, this is sort of realizing the ideas of trouble. Allows us an understanding of the relationship between personal troubles and public issues. And this is, I would suspect, every introductory sociology course raises the concept of the sociological imagination to try to explain what it is we think we're doing in sociology, this individual personal troubles and public issues. I always like to unpack that into two key elements. The first is sort of an analytical element, and it's population or evolutionary thinking if you move outside sociology. Individual lives are shaped by context, but individual lives in turn shape the context. So there's a notion of reconciling agency and structure, the big stuff that constrains you, but also your actions that change the big stuff. But there's also a second and an element of the sociological imagination, as I've articulated, that's an ethical stance, because things are being labeled as personal troubles, that there's something wrong here. And to say that requires, as Scott pointed out, an ethical stance. So there have been, for a long time, even when we started working, strong ethical arguments invoked in policy analysis. Utilitarianism is the dominant one. It's just the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. It goes back to Bentham and Mill. In policy analysis, it's implemented as benefit cost risk analysis, with microeconomic theory providing a sort of underpinning framework. It's absolutely dominant in policy analysis. It's legally mandated for a lot of US government decisions. It's a lot of international development organizations mandated. It's used in other countries as well. It's really the big thing in policy analysis. Now, with regard to equity and justice issues, benefit cost analysis usually ignores them. But I always want to be careful not to characterize or caricature what economists do. There is no reason you couldn't include equity or distributional concerns, justice concerns, in benefit cost analysis, as long as you could come up with a set of weights as to how you give preference to benefits and costs to some groups over others. The problem is that those weights there's no consensus about what those weights should be, so they end up never being used. So in practice, equity tends to get ignored. In principle, it could be included. The second thing that became very prominent, as I mentioned, with Reagan being elected, is a libertarian perspective on policy. And the idea is that you want to maximize individual freedom. Usually this is an argument against government intervention in favor of unregulated markets and private mechanisms of allocating resources. It's become extremely influential. It has serious intellectual basis in the Austrian School of Economics, particularly von Mises and Hayek. It led to public choice theory. James Buchanan, who won the Nobel for public choice theory, was a colleague of mine at George Mason for a while. And it has a popular version in the ideas of Ayn Rand that gets touted around a lot. And I do want to be fair to some of the libertarians like Milton Friedman, that they saw a sort of authoritarian tendency in the work of Ayn Rand and were highly critical of Rand. That while we tend to lump together libertarians, while I disagree with most of Friedman's arguments about the essence of markets as the way to maximize human well-being, there are places where he's sharply critical of the kind of great person view that Rand seems to subscribe to. Well, this idea of libertarianism became part of federal policy under Reagan with the appointment of Watt as the Secretary of Interior and Ann Gorsuch as the administrator of EPA. When Scott and I first got to Washington, we had many colleagues and in fact a monthly lunch of folks working on social impact assessment, and the majority of people at that lunch were people working in the federal agencies doing this kind of work. They were RIFT, reduction in force, which is the way you fire a federal employee, or if they had enough seniority, reassigned to jobs that did not involve social impact assessment. So there was a real setback in this approach to policy analysis. Just as an aside, I mentioned risk analysis before, and Gorsuch created such scandals as administrator at EPA because of her sort of cozy relationships with industry, that William Ruckelshaus was brought in to kind of depoliticize the agency, and Ruckelshaus, in his move to counter the problems that had been seen with Gorsuch, invoked risk analysis as a scientific basis for decision-making at EPA, and that's part of why risk analysis rose in our considerations in the 1980s. Okay, so under libertarianism, inequality and justice issues are largely assumed away. There's also deliberative ethics. The idea is that rational decisions are those that emerge from fair and competent discourse among interested and affected parties. It has its origins perhaps in Dewey. The most prominent advocate in the 20th century was Habermas. So it's a very sociological approach, and I'm going to say a lot more about it as we go forward. But those are the sort of big three that are there. What, again, Scott emphasized was that if you're going to engage in the policy discourse, it really behooves you to think about ethical theories. This quote from Arnie Nace is at the beginning of one of the key papers in this argument by Scott. Arnie Nace was one of the founders of the school of thought called deep ecology. And I'll read the quote. Quote, "An ethical theory is required to judge changes as negative or positive. Chemistry, physics, and the science of ecology acknowledge only change and not value change." And the point in the paper is that if we as sociologists are going to get engaged in policy, we need to think about valued change. Sociologists are much engaged in identifying personal troubles and public issues that shape them. Understanding processes and contexts that shape the lives of individuals and communities is sort of part of what we do. And that can be construed simply as positive science, a description of what is happening, explorations of causal mechanisms, social constructions by those involved, et cetera. But most sociologists are motivated by ethical concerns. We usually study things we consider to be social problems or the resolution of social problems. But to say a condition is a problem, sorry for the plural there, to say a condition is a problem requires an ethical theory. And unfortunately, this is still true. Scott was sort of arguing that we need to move past this, but sociologists are often vague about ethical theory that underpins their concerns. This is in sharp contrast to utilitarian and libertarian analysis, where there are fairly explicit ethical criteria that focus analysis and suggest which decisions are better or worse. And most economists, if they're at all thoughtful who do policy analysis, can invoke utilitarian ethics and offer some defense of why they do the kinds of analyses they do. Certainly as sociologists, we pick research topics because we think they're important, and personal ethics is usually a guide in that choice. What we decide is important depends substantially on ethics. But there will always be trade-offs. Building an energy facility creates jobs, but often also pollution, and it disrupts the existing community. How do we make those trade-offs? So in a series of papers, Scott and his collaborators make this point and offer some specific proposals for ethical criteria. These are the three key papers, one in Environmental Impact Assessment Review and two in the Journal of Environmental Systems. Again, my point is we can avoid this issue when we select a research project, because that's just, taking what we're personally concerned with, and we don't have to make a larger argument about why it's important. But if you're going to engage in policy-focused research like risk analysis or social impact assessment, I believe, and Scott argued, that you have to take ethical theory centrally. So to quote one of the papers, quote, assessment of natural resource management strategies raises the question of valuation. What is to be preferred and why? It is not possible to distinguish between good and bad management alternatives without some value criteria defining social well-being. Okay, so that's kind of the motivation. And in those papers, they suggest two criteria that drive their ethics, two things that they argue these are things to avoid, policies that generate these things are not so good, policies that minimize these things are better. And the two are conflict, polarization, and futures foregone. I want to note that the work is especially attentive to environmental justice issues in that the papers emphasize not imposing solutions favored by a majority on the minority. And in fact, one of the papers has an explicit critique of some of my work at the same time, at the same period of time, on deliberative ethics, with the argument that a deliberative process could lead to the majority overwhelming the interests of the minority. Now, I don't believe that is the case, but certainly that critique helped me sharpen my arguments about both the need for diversity in deliberative processes and in processes themselves, how you conduct this kind of engagement and discussion that are attentive to the needs of minorities and people who are less often engaged in these kinds of activities. The papers themselves propose and implement methods for assessing the criteria around natural resource decision-making. So let me talk first about conflict polarization. And this is how they define it. Quote, social conflict cleavages are divisions between groups over values that create fronts of mutual opposition. Conflict cleavages cannot be eliminated from society, nor would we necessarily want to eliminate them because they have positive functions. The important question is not whether conflict exists or how it might be eliminated, but how conflict cleavages are organized in relationship to one another. Social conflict cleavages are conceptualized as ranging along a continuum from overlapping to cross-cutting. And the little diagram here on the left shows two hypothetical examples of two situations. In one, the policies for wood harvest, for grazing, and for preserving wilderness end up being set up so that for every one of those policies, the same people are winners and losers, and so you have conflict polarization. And what Scott et al. Are arguing is that it is better to have a policy where those who are on opposite sides of the wood harvest cleavage might be on the same side as on the grazing cleavage, and that there's a different alignment around the wilderness cleavage, so you have cross-cutting ties and not the kind of polarization that you might get with a different set of policies. Given the current state of US politics, this emphasis on avoiding conflict polarization seems very prescient. It relates to environmental justice in that when conflicts are polarized, the interests of the least powerful are likely to be pushed aside. Then their other criteria is futures foregone. And again, I can do no better than to read their statement. Quote, futures foregone addresses the question, who will be disadvantaged if an alternative is implemented? One key way to help or to hurt people is to support or undercut futures for their activities. A foregone future means that implementation of an alternative will cancel futures for activities, thereby undercutting the opportunity for individuals to pursue such activities. Social well-being is served when futures for choice opportunities are increased or are foregone as little as possible. And I note that this does resonate a little bit with libertarianism. And part of the logic that Scott certainly emphasized and that I emphasize is that usually one criteria is not sufficient, that we really do have to acknowledge that there are multiple good and bad things in the world, and ultimately we will have to make trade-offs of them. Sometimes when I've written about this stuff, people question why I give any credit at all to a libertarian perspective. But in fact, I would argue that if other things are taken into consideration too, increasing individual choice options is a good idea. The underpinning logic has something to do with risk. The logic is that the future is uncertain and that it's important to preserve options for individuals and communities to be able to redirect course in the future. This harkens a lot to Robert Merton's notion of unintended consequences of social actions, and is very much related to Donald Campbell, the social psychologist's idea derived from Dewey of an experimenting society and thinking of reforms, including policies and programs as experiments. To paraphrase the wonderful Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, a political scientist. I had the great privilege of collaborating with Lynn a lot. What Lynn always said essentially is, we don't know what to do, but we can try things and learn as we go. And that's how we have to think about policy and programs. And that's what Futures Foregone is getting at, that you want to, in experimenting, try to avoid policies that block off future possibilities. Okay, those are their two criteria. There are a bunch of other criteria floating about. In the book that I'm working on that should be out 9 months or a year from now, I suggest a series of other criteria. There are basic criteria that are like Scott's, and the three I propose, in addition to Scott's, are to improve human well-being while we reduce stress on the environment. And that's sort of a sustainability criteria. I acknowledge utilitarianism and suggest that efficiency and allocation of resources, the greatest good for the greatest number, is a good thing. It's not the only thing, but all other things being taken into account, it's a good thing to do. And indeed, as I mentioned a moment ago, enhancing freedom is a good thing. The libertarian criteria, again, not the only thing, not I'll use the word, trump other perspectives or other criteria, but if it can be achieved while some of the others are as well, not a bad thing. And what I was saying is that even though I and many of us have problems with some of the manifestations of libertarianism, the idea of enhancing freedom is a reasonable idea as long as it's not the only ethical criteria on the table. And then the next four criteria I suggest are really process criteria. How do you conduct these processes? So one is the idea of competence about facts and values. You have to have a reasonable way to engage science and local knowledge to figure out what's going on in the context where a decision has to be made. But also I argue that you need to be careful about value competence, because we can short circuit value judgments around new issues or new phenomena and not really think through the value implications of something that is relatively novel or a problem that is new in a particular context. And so because we're prone to things, essentially snap judgments, and there's of course a whole social psychological literature on this, we need to be careful about how we go about engaging values as well. Fairness in process and outcomes is a justice criteria. Fairness in process means not only getting diverse people who are interested in or will be affected by a problem at the table, but also making sure that the way the process runs is respectful of the way in which they can effectively engage, rather than imposing a process that's predefined. But also we want to have process and outcomes. We hope fairness and process will lead to process and outcomes, but we always have to kind of keep an eye on that, because there are, as Merton pointed out, unintended consequences. Process should rely on human cognitive strengths and be attentive to our weaknesses. We're terrible at processing information about uncertainty. Huge literature in cognitive psychology shows us that. So we have to have ways to kind of work around that. On the other hand, we know from a long history that we're very good at deliberation if deliberations are reasonably well structured. And so we want to have processes that build on our strengths and compensate for our weaknesses. And finally, to get back to the point of the previous slide, long ago now, about futures foregone, we want to have a chance to learn. We don't know what we're doing exactly. And so we want to make decisions and learn from them, what's called in the jargon adaptive risk management, rather than thinking that the decision we make now will be perfectly good 50 to 100 years in the future. So those are the criteria I add to or complement Scott's criteria with. But then the issue comes up about how do we address trade-offs across criteria? How do we make good use of the science in understanding the implications of a decision for the different criteria? So there's been a lot of progress on the deliberative approach. The US National Academies and other bodies have often recommended a process of linking analysis and public deliberation. It's sometimes called analytic deliberation in the shorthand. And it's diagrammed on the right. But the basic idea is that it's an iterative process that's co-designed by all involved, often with consultation from experts on process, people who study how these processes work. And the idea is we want to get the science right. And that means that we often have to rely on community expertise. Jean Rosa wrote very eloquently about this, that we have sort of very abstract science that's all well and good, but for environmental and sustainability decision-making, we have to apply that in local context. And so to make it relevant, you've got to also bring in what is often called indigenous and local knowledge. And we also want to get the right science. I mentioned before modeling efforts that were modeling what we knew how to model, whether those things were particularly important to the community or not. So the idea of this process is it raises the issues that will be of concern to the communities that will be impacted by a decision, so that we get those issues on the scientific agenda rather than having sort of an abstract agenda that may not speak to the issues that matter for the community. And part of this whole process, the hope of this whole process, is it builds trust in science. There's also a hope that over time, fair and competent deliberative processes can effectively meld facts and values to guide decisions, allow our beliefs and values to evolve, and build trust and competence. And this is a whole series of reports, the first 4 from the US National Research Council, the last one from the Canadian equivalent, on a wide variety of issues ranging from managing wild horses and burros, extremely controversial issue, to editing the human genome. And all of these reports make strong recommendations for using these kinds of deliberative processes to meld together science with other kinds of information and with values to understand both how to get the science right and how to get the right science, and ultimately how to make trade-offs across values. Well, the question comes up of this idea of deliberation is nice, but does it actually work? So in 2008, we did a very substantial study of public participation processes. And the conclusion, which is actually a statement by the National Academies of Science, because once it's passed review, that's the authority of the statement, is, quote, when done well, public participation improves the quality and legitimacy of decisions and builds the capacity of all involved to engage in the policy process. And the report also notes that 3 goals can be achieved. When done well, participation improves the quality of decisions or assessments, the legitimacy of those decisions, and the capacity for decision-making of everyone involved. And I would argue that this is sort of the evolution that came from the kinds of work that Scott was doing. In those papers, I didn't get into it, but there's the proposal to use, and sometimes the implementation, of a Delphi method of eliciting a diverse set of opinions on conflict, polarization, and futures foregone. And sort of this is how this has evolved over several decades into these deliberative processes. And I'm going to close out pretty quickly just by emphasizing the importance of diversity and acknowledging multiple forms of expertise. Some friends of mine, Kyle White in particular, have argued maybe expertise isn't the best term, but it's what I've used in print. So for now, I'll stick with it. We, of course, need the standard sort of scientific expertise about the substance under consideration, the ecosystem or whatever we're looking at. It's also useful, as I mentioned, to have expertise about process and decision-making, folks who actually study these things to make sure that the processes of deliberation work well. You need, of course, to have the community expertise, as I pointed out, the sort of traditional ecological knowledge based on life experience, sometimes many generations of living in these ecosystems. I've argued that it's useful to have political expertise, people who understand sort of tacit agreements and existing conflicts and things like that. And then there's value expertise. And my argument is that everybody has legitimacy with regard to values, but a good process and careful research can help articulate values and reduce value conflict. Okay, and here I'm gonna, in the interest of time, just skip over this, but we also know that diversity is essential for doing science. Science is an evolutionary process. Evolution works best when there's a lot of diversity. So we need to have diversity in science itself, and diversity takes many forms: disciplines, personal backgrounds, and engaging other forms of expertise. There's still the problem with these kinds of deliberative processes of anthropocentrism. We do know that many indigenous political systems in the Northeast and North America use broad forms of deliberation for governance, and often had people who, quote, speak for wolf, unquote. On a lighter note, Karl Barks has Uncle Scrooge in a 1957 comic book trying to buy the development rights for some wilderness lakes. And he's speaking to the leader of the local indigenous community, offering him money to buy these lakes. And and the response of the indigenous leader is, none could sign away these woodlands, none could have the right or reason, but the chiefs of all the brothers, and by implication sisters, because who he's referring to as brothers are the other species that are standing with him, in powwow with the seasons, that is in consultation with the biophysical environment in itself. Thought that was, for 1957, quite eloquent statement. So let me close with this, and I'm going to have to plug in my battery. My computer is warning me. I think sociology would benefit from spending more attention to the ethical criteria that we use in thinking through what are good and bad things in terms of personal troubles. Scott was an innovator in this, and I hope my short engagement with part of his work that's not as well known makes clear how he was really arguing for the first steps towards what became the idea of linking scientific discourse and ethical considerations and incorporating diversity into our considerations. His work exemplified the best of the sociological imagination and helped shape, from that beginning that we had about environmental justice, contemporary approaches to social science, work on policy and environmental justice. He is missed, but he is well.
Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, I think it will be best if we start the discussion with hand signals. If you'd like to put questions into the chat, that's a possibility too, and I can read the I also should mention that we had planned a session at the Midwest Sociological Society meetings 2 years ago. Alex Stoner was one of the participants, Paul Sickenthal, and a couple of others, but because of the pandemic, obviously we had to cancel it. And Thomas Dietz's talk would have been the centerpiece. So in a way, we are making up for that right now.
It was so heartwarming to see all these pictures of Scott, and then also so nice to see Sally. So I'm so delighted that we're doing this. It feels very late in coming, but you know, part of it was just figuring out how to put things together. It's taken us a couple of years to figure that out.
Great.
So I think we have the first question. That's John Jeffner, who here appears as United Campus Workers. If you still want to make an appearance, there we go. Okay, John, go ahead.
Dr. Dietz, thanks so much for this talk. It was really fascinating, and I appreciated all pieces of it, especially the reminders of Scott's important contributions. I guess I'm wondering about the engagement with libertarianism. Libertarianism's engagement with freedom always prioritizes, always privileges the individual. And right. What you're focused on, at least in part or large part, is sustainability, which seems to be the most collective of values. And right. So I wonder why engage with libertarians' take on freedom as opposed to so many others that may more properly, more effectively lift up the collective notion of freedom, because certainly there are other notions of freedom.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, part of it is to note that libertarianism has, in my view, unfortunately, become very influential in the policy discourse. Particularly the more difficult, what I see as ethically difficult parts of libertarianism. But part of it too is that I would argue that if we know we're doing a good job around equity issues, around taking care of the environment, other species, if we're meeting all the other criteria, and we have two policy options that are about the same on both grounds, that one that allows more freedom of choice is a good thing. And one of the things I do in the book is to point out that libertarianism is really just the US version of anarchism. And if you begin to move back to the roots of anarchism, you actually find connections with a lot of arguments about collective movements. So that in the book, where I spend a little more time on this, I try to argue that there is an intellectual tradition here that I think is worthy of some respect, but always in the context that we're never going to focus solely on any one criteria. We have to find ways of balancing them all. And one of the things I also try to point out in the book is to address, for example, the Ayn Rand problem I mentioned, but also that Milton Friedman was an architect of school choice, and the first implementation of school choice was to encourage segregation, or to find a mechanism to preserve segregation. So I do try to be attentive to the sort of dark side of libertarianism, and I take your point very well, that maybe what I should be talking more about is sort of the anarchist tradition of avoiding. I also have a long footnote in the book where I actually cite some scholars who pointing out that libertarians are hugely concerned about the power of large government and completely oblivious to the power of large corporations. So I appreciate this, and you're the second person who has sort of raised this issue. One of them was one of the reviewers of the book, and maybe I really need to reframe libertarianism as anarchism and say there's some things to be learned from this tradition that are very valuable, and the libertarian spin on it is really a perversion, because they're not concerned with all large and powerful structures, only with government. So thank you, and I hope that's responsive. If not, let me know.
Would you like to respond, John, or are you fine?
I'm good with anarchism.
Okay. The next question comes from Paul Gallot, and then Sarah D'Onofrio. So Paul.
Thanks. Tom, this was wonderful, and in so many ways. Thank you for your celebration of Scott's work, and for highlighting these different aspects of it, and for being the first Scott Frey Memorial Lecture giver. I think it's very appropriate, and so I really appreciate that. I actually wanted to pick up on a related point to where you ended in your answer to the first question, which is around power. And you were saying the libertarians, are not so good with government power, fine with corporate power. And I wondered if you could say more about, you ended on, participation when done well does a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways in which unequal power messes up participation. And
Right.
So I wondered if you had thoughts, or, it sounded like you've done a lot of thinking about the whole notion of deliberative democracy, although I didn't hear you say the word democracy so much as deliberation itself. So I wondered if you could elaborate on how we deal with the inequalities of power, the persistence of social conflict, which is where you started, and a deliberative process.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The talk, I really, because of where Scott's work was and the context in which we were all working at the time, the social impact assessment stuff, was very much about how do we do this kind of process that informs policy within, the context of the US, although it could be done elsewhere. And so it's sort of a very small scale stuff. So let me go on two tangents. One is in that public participation report, we use the idea of diagnostic questions, which we derive from Eleanor Ostrom, and say, okay, if you're going to be trying to implement a deliberative process in a particular context around a specific decision, and usually in the analyses we were doing, government agency decisions, here's how to diagnose the situation. And then here are design principles to try to make sure that this process ends up being one that produces good outcomes. And we certainly acknowledge and talk a lot about all the terrible participatory processes that exist, even within the context of US federal government decision-making. Our point is that, as the conclusion says, when done well, and then we talk about, okay, first you got to figure out what context you're in. What are the conflicts? What are the power differentials? All those kinds of things. And then here are some design principles about how you set up a tailored process that will work well given the problems you face. So that's at the sort of micro level. But I've also written stuff about how do we, I guess what I argue is we know how to do these deliberative processes well. We don't do them well all the time, but we know how to do them well when the problem is local to regional in scale. What we don't know as well is how to build a deliberative democracy at the national level. And I've written a little bit on how do we deal with sort of existential threats like climate change and others, where we need a global deliberative process, and what are the challenges to do that. And I think what I would say about that is, I think those are the next big challenges. There's a challenge of implementing what we know how to do at the local to regional level, of course. And that can solve a lot of problems that have a local to regional context. But how we overcome power differentials and actually implement a deliberative democracy is very difficult. And one of the images I just finished redoing for the book, there is an institute in Sweden that looks at multiple sort of forms of democracy and how they've changed over time. And I put in there a plot of how the form of deliberative democracy, where they have criteria that indicate that a government of a nation uses more or less deliberative processes, has actually been in sharp decline for about 10 years or so. And so I think those are the open challenges. How do we get there from here? What kinds of conditions favor them? And I have bits of speculation about them, but I certainly don't have answers. I think that's where we need to be doing a lot of our work.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. So Sarah D'Onofrio is next.
Hi, great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am writing my dissertation on environmental justice and environmental policy and solutions and things of the sort. And I was noticing in your process criteria and your various criterias that you presented, when you were introducing the talk, you mentioned avoiding idealism, but the environmental justice literature recently has highlighted that using procedural justice, using the state, has not actually worked in practice. And only about one case has been resolved using the Environmental Justice Office in the EPA.
Right.
So there are lots of issues around using, like, the state actually being effective. And that's why scholars like Pello, as you know, have started using anarchism, right? But the issue with anarchism and libertarianism, right, is that it's individual and community-based. But how do we, and this is kind of addressing the next, what you just asked, I want to go into that a little bit deeper. How do we scale up these things? This seems incredibly abstract, but that is the fight that we're going to be having to deal with. And how do we not fall into the trap of recreating neoliberal environmental policy, particularly when you mentioned the focus on individuals? That is also a very, very important dimension of neoliberalism. So how do we avoid recreating these policy ideas?
Yeah, first of all, I said it too quickly, I think. But what I was trying to say about the best is the enemy of the good is it is important to have utopian thinking. You know, we have to think about, gee, what's out there? But what I also see sometimes is that, you know, say around a different domain where I work a lot, is sort of climate change solutions, a rejection of a particular approach that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the US by 5% because that won't solve the problem. Well, nothing solves the problem in that sense. We may need an accumulation of things, each of which is good, being careful, as Richard York points out, to make sure that they're not sort of conflicting with each other or, you know, one action blocking another action that may be more important. Of course, we need to do that analysis, but that's the sort of context of that. So let's not look for a complete, let's imagine what an ideal world looks like. Indeed, my friend John Robinson at University of Toronto long ago talked about backcasting. Bring a community together, imagine what the world, your community should look like in 20 years. And now let's not forecast, let's look backward. How do we get there from here? So you need the utopian vision, but you also have to start with where you are and work forward. I go back to, you know, I worked a lot with Eleanor Ostrom, and Lynn, first of all, pointed out that one of her basic principles is we tend to talk about the state, the market, capitalism, and the community, but none of those things ever exist in the abstract. They're all sort of melded together in any social institutional arrangement. So the issue is how to figure out institutional rules, processes, et cetera, that make things better without sort of then blocking, sort of, oh, we're just back to neoliberalism and all the problems recreate itself. We have to kind of anticipate avoiding that, but also take incremental steps of institutional design. And I think a lot can be done at the local level that gives us examples, but we still face the problem of scaling up. So I guess my vision, and I don't really have a solution to this problem, but my vision is that we need to learn a lot from local to regional experiments where it's easier in some contexts. I mean, some contexts it's impossible, but there are contexts where it's possible to make some progress and learn what worked and what didn't and see the degree to which that generalizes. Then the problem of scaling up, I think, is a huge one. And as I was alluding to, and I've written a little bit about this, is one where I don't think we know how to move very well towards national and global society, except perhaps by learning from these examples. But again, the reason I raised Lynn's point is that we also have to be careful as sociologists not to sort of juxtapose capitalism and markets with the state, that these things are all these complicated hybrids, and it's a matter of changing rules, the way Lynn would put it, through political processes and other processes that lead to a better melding of these different dimensions. I'm trying to think. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, because nothing was ever published from it, but there was a dissertation at George Mason University by Cynthia Warwick on 4 or 5 cases of environmental justice success. She wanted to look at environmental justice issues where the communities had gotten more or less what they wanted. And Cynthia went on to a distinguished career in administration. She's been president of several historically Black colleges and universities, and so she never published anything. But if you find that dissertation, it's an interesting example of her finding some case studies around the country of situations where the communities were successful at getting what they wanted, essentially, and why. And well, she's done more important things in some sense, but it's a shame that those arguments about what led to success have never gotten into the literature much. So I can send me an email and I can give you the link. Cynthia, I was chair of her dissertation. She's in some ways my most successful student because she's out there, managing these wonderful institutions. She's gone through a succession of them as president, but and I think we need more of that kind of work of where have we had successes? I mean, I think as sociologists, we tend to have a critical stance, and that's good and that's understandable, but we may not identify the places where things are really working well and try to understand how you get success. So again, that's one place I think we may be able to learn how to do better. Hope that helps.
Okay, the next question is from Alex Stoner.
Hi,
Who was
thanks for
one of the participants in the session at the Midwest 2 years ago that we had to cancel.
Yes, we had to cancel this because of the pandemic, which of course is ongoing. Thanks for such an engaging talk. And my question's along the same lines as the previous ones about, in addition to the deliberative question, about the question about institutions and scaling up. Do you think there are international institutions currently in existence that could be reformed in line with a more deliberative approach, or have to create entirely new institutions?
First, I have to say I'm not an expert on international institutions. That all of my work is very US centric, and so I'm very naive about this. But I think there are some moves, I mean, there are deep flaws, but there has been an evolution of the international assessment processes, of which the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the most prominent, towards at least broadening their scope and compass. And I wonder if they could, rather than starting de novo, that there could be spin-offs from those assessment processes, which are very specifically intended only to assess the facts. I mean, that's their mandate and they're policed, but using them as a platform to start a process that now engages, as these kind of deliberative processes I've argued about, to engage more with communities around the world and values. Now, I'm aware, but I don't know much or any about them, that there have been a lot of efforts to do deliberative experiments in many parts of the world. It's just outside my expertise as to what that literature actually says about things. But again, I mean, in some ways, I guess the way I would put what I'm saying is, yeah, I think the work that Scott started, the work that I've been engaged in, we've been pretty successful. Not that it gets done right all the time, but we've learned a lot about how to do it well at the national to regional level in the US and other sort of Western industrial nations. And, you know, and our acute failure is, yeah, we haven't figured out how to do it beyond that. That's sort of the next set of tasks that hopefully can be informed by what we've done, but we're not there. Yeah, I mean, another literature that I'm trying to learn more about is the growing literature on, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but there seems to be a resurgence of it on nonviolent social change. You know, there are institutes that have been around forever. I was around at Kent State when we started the Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and I was involved in creating a PhD program at George Mason in conflict resolution. But I think the sort of serious analysis of what works and what doesn't work, it can help us go forward. As part of the background, I watched the commons literature evolve from Hardin's terrible essay, and I got to work very closely with Lynn Ostrom. And I sort of see that as an interesting success story, in the sense that as a social science community, that we figured out a lot about how to manage commons using communities, and that a lot of that wisdom, that insight, is slowly being incorporated into commons management. And it's sort of our task as social sciences, our privilege is to try to help understand things. We also want to affect change, but we need to remember that the special thing we can bring that's harder for others to do is that sort of large scale or broad analysis. We may not have as much insights into particular community situation for sure as the people in that community, but we have the ability to look across communities and help people talk to each other, things like that. So that's a kind of sense of that we did that, I think, pretty successfully around commons. Not that it all gets implemented, but the knowledge base is there. And I'm hoping we can do that more broadly around other deliberative resource management and equity problems.
Thank you.
So with all these questions, I'm sort of ducking and saying, yeah, I don't have the answers to those. I think those are the next set of challenges, really.
So if I may interject then and ask for potentially a piece of advice that you might bestow upon the younger generation of sociologists, especially in the area of environmental sociology, but not only. In one of the, and I mean, this issue has come up twice. One, and I'm extending the conversation about deliberation here. My hat is Habermas, and just one of the hats, not the main one. And so deliberative democracy is something I've been interested in some time, of course. And then on the other hand, the issue of what we are capable of. And so what we are capable of obviously depends to some extent also on what we are allowed to be capable of. Right. And so with this wave of memory loss that's currently running around across the US, where our ability to discuss issues, to deliberate about, for example, the situation of LGBTQ plus people of racial issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a question of time in a sense. And so we're basically ending kind of an arc in this regard, starting from the 1950s, 1960s, when environmental issues made it onto the table, to it not being difficult to imagine that at some point there will be efforts afoot legislatively to prevent us from addressing environmental issues.
Yeah. And
so I'm wondering whether you have sort of any suggestions for not us, we are older obviously, but for those who are in their 20s and their early 30s who will play a significantly greater role in shaping the world of the future, of how to approach this without getting completely depressed and demoralized and sort of how to plug it.
Yeah, it's sometimes I think that the old-fashioned notion of roles is useful if one doesn't push it too far. But I would say for those of you who are starting your professional careers, think about what is special about the role you might play, if you're an academic. I mean, not all of us will become academics, and that's one of the nice things that more and more sociologists are going into other institutional contexts. But keep in mind that the university is not necessarily the best place from which to organize a social movement. You have, through teaching and research, special opportunities and capabilities, institutional capabilities that folks who are, say, in the social movement organizations may not have. And so keep that in mind, because we don't want to squander that resource. It's under threat a lot, but it is, I think, very special. So thinking how you can contribute to social change, but by making good use of the special leverage you have in that context. So that's sort of the professional role. Now, that doesn't mean you're not engaged with social movements, but it is thinking about what it is you can do that the typical person in a social movement doesn't do. My colleague, Jennifer Carrera, does a lot of work at Flint, and she's deeply engaged. And in fact, I think one of the interesting examples is that many of her papers, the co-authors, are members of the community, not going to high school, or certainly not going to college, and some of them have, but they're the people who are providing the local knowledge about what's going on in Flint that she melds together, and then they co-author papers that appear in the peer-reviewed literature. So that's sort of one model. She brings her methodological and analytical skills, and they bring their understanding of the context. Okay, in terms of citizens, I mean, I'm in Vermont, and I've learned a lot of lessons by living here for the last 30 years. And part of it is that democracy is small scale. I talk in the book about what was the scale of democracy when the United States was founded. Despite all the biases, the racial and gender and class biases in the Constitution, there was also the issue that the scale of democracy was very different. And one of the things I think that happens in concern with politics is that there's a tendency to ignore the local. That folks, I mean, it's appropriate to get out there and get active in presidential campaigns and Senate and House campaigns, but often school board campaigns and local city council elections and things like that kind of get ignored. And yet the leverage one has by devoting some hours and energy to those elections may be much higher than the marginal benefits you get from participating in a presidential election. So I would urge you, in terms of political activity, to think carefully about where things can matter the most. Despite the horrible things that are happening with gerrymandering, it is true, since over the last election cycle, that a number of states, Michigan included, passed very substantial reforms to redistricting that I think in the long run will really shift power. I mean, they're being fought out now, obviously, big court cases, those with power spending a lot of money to allow gerrymandering and redistricting. But there are many states where those reforms took place, and those were very much grassroots efforts, and the ones I'm aware of, at least, where a relatively small number of people got together and got organized, that built a movement and managed to get, in the case of Michigan, an initiative on the ballot, so that basically the people who are on the redistricting commission cannot be politicians, cannot have worked for politicians, cannot be relatives of politicians, and then of the remaining pool, people are drawn at random. It's an interesting model, and I'm not saying it's perfect or it's even working well, but it's a start. So again, thinking about where you have leverage, where your particular talents and abilities and time allocations can have the biggest impact, I think is very important. And it may not be in the most glamorous, the things that have the most glamorous and visible outcomes.
So thank you very much. In terms of time, we have to shut it down, but I'd like to bring it back to Scott once more.
Sure.
So Scott and I came here at the same time in 2004, and we had some common interests, especially in film. So oftentimes had at least weekly conversations. Your name came up dozens of times. And the side of Scott you presented today is not, I think I'm not overstating my case here, is not a side that we became particularly familiar with. So he did not address the ethical issue as explicitly as he clearly did earlier in his career. And during the last meeting, he and the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and I had, the Dean at some point responded to Scott addressing the issue of neoliberalism and the state of the environment by asking, so can we do anything? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? And his response was to bear witness. And he said it exactly in the dry kind of manner.
Right, yeah.
Why do you think he, since you clearly were continuously in contact with him, why do you think he dropped his interest in the ethical dimension, which at some point had been so illicit later on?
Yeah, well, I think it was, my sense was it was a couple of convergent things. First of all, he became, I would say he became an administrator, but he certainly spent a number of, he was chair at a number of places. And of course, that's very time consuming, so you can't do anything. And also the work, he'd always engaged in multiple lines of research. I mean, there are 4 or 5 lines of research that I thought were very interesting, but where he did 1 or 2 papers. And so those papers had some impact, but it wasn't as impactful as the other stuff. And I think with regard to the ethical stuff, that just as the context for doing that work around social impact assessment in particular was being devastated by these changes in federal policy. So that the community, I mentioned the community we talked to in Washington just disappeared over the course of a couple of months after Reagan became president, that those meetings stopped with federal sociologists, environmental sociologists just stopped because they weren't there anymore. At the same time, the kind of work he was doing on international issues and environmental justice really began to explode and began to attract a lot of interest. So my sense was, I mean, he always was aware of that stuff, and he was never much engaged. You know, the same thing was true with the risk work, except as it got incorporated into the international work, that he'd done a lot of early work on risk and conceptualization of risk and how does this matter in sociology. And it was another line he just never followed up on. And I see it as there may be some deeper considerations, but basically the opportunity structures weren't there. And he was at a stage in his career because he was chair where he had to be very careful about allocating resources across, personal life and family, his role as chair, and his role as a researcher. So that's my sense. I mean, he and I talked about the stuff, and he was aware of some of the new things that we're developing. I think he was always a little disappointed, as was I, that people didn't implement more those 2 approaches, 2 measures in impact assessment. But again, there wasn't, the field had sort of collapsed to some extent because of the changes and how the feds did things. So that's my sense of why it never came up much more. But there is this constancy with, my comment earlier before we started about, that dry way I remember him saying that in a very dry way in response to some comment, what are you, some kind of red? And, yeah, bear witness is the same kind of deep insight expressed with dry humor.
Exactly. Okay, is there anyone else who would like to ask a quick question?
I just have a quick comment, not question related to Scott. I remember that he was the first kind of faculty when I came to Knoxville when I was still working on my dissertation, and I was very late because I could not find his office, and then so he was talking with me and about sociology, everything else, and then later on he often talked to me about his trip to Asia and his work related to Asia and especially in Vietnam. And he also wrote me a supporting letter, recommendation for me to go to Fulbright, and I got Fulbright. So was very appreciate his effort. So this is my sort of short memory, little time frame I met with him, and we had a couple times coffee in the library and talk about Asia and research. So that was fun. Yeah.
I had mentioned before we started, and I won't tell the whole story, but I was talking to Andrew Jorgensen last night, and he had a recollection of Scott. Scott was always very aware of what other people were doing and finding ways to be kind and supportive and engaged with people. It was, and you run into people all the time who have a little Scott story to tell of just a small
Yes.
engagement, but one that was very supportive and very attentive to who they were and what they were doing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
definitely.
wonderful, wonderful person.
Yeah.
And again, I want to apologize for these kind of internet problems I had. I thought I had guarded against those, but thank you. And again, how honored I am to have been asked to do this. It really means a great deal to me. If any of you have sort of follow-up questions or thoughts, my email is just tdietz@msu.edu. And
Yeah.
feel free to contact me.
And we appreciate your time and effort, because I know we have been talking about this since like almost a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard to get everybody's, schedule at the same time. And we wish you could be here in Knoxville, but hopefully next time.
Yeah. And do let me know when this comes around again, that if it's on Zoom, but I would love to visit as well. Next time I know that I'm going, I'll try to make a joint trip between Nashville and Knoxville.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Dietz, are you originally from Cleveland, Ohio?
I was born and raised in Kent.
Kent? Okay. All
Yeah.
right. I thought I'm from Cleveland, so I thought I could hear that. And then someone said you went to Kent State, so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know Alex Bevan. Alex Bevan's a good friend. Alex is a sort of folk music institution in Cleveland.
Okay. I don't.
Yeah, it's an obscure reference, but yeah, in fact, I was just starting to make plans to go back for the 50th anniversary of the shootings. Didn't happen. Well, it happened online, and it looks like this year will be the closest we come to that. So I'm just making arrangements to go back.
I had a journalism professor who was Carmen, or do you know Carmen? I can't remember her last name. She was a journalism professor at John Carroll, who does a lot with that as well.
That name is familiar, and I've noticed that there's been several undergraduate theses at John Carroll on Kent State. Yeah. If I'll put a little plug in, if any of you are interested in Kent State and the shootings, Tom Grace, who was one of the wounded, wrote his PhD dissertation on the history of social protest at Kent. And there's one chapter on the shootings, but he really wanted to put it into a broader context. And so it's an account by a historian who was also in the midst of it, if you will. And it's Tom Grace, Kent State. And then there's a graphic novel by a graphic novelist named Durf Backdurf, who has done an incredible job of capturing the look and feel of that period and that place in the anti-war movement. When I read it and some of my friends read it, we were astounded at how much he captured, even down to, yeah, those were the signs that were in the window of that store in that spring. But also, I mean, the field. So I was at Kent State. I was, Chien-fei mentioned, I was one of the founders of the Legal Defense Fund. There were 24 students and one faculty member indicted by a state grand jury afterwards. The one faculty member indicted was Tom Luff, who may have been one of the very first environmental sociologists. But the sequelae of being indicted and all this stuff that, even though we got those charges dropped eventually that came with it, he didn't publish anything for decades. But in the 1960s, he was doing environmental sociology in a very prescient way. So mention that to give credit to sort of the history of the field, sort of the hidden history of the field in this case. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I will process this recording. I will edit it, and then I'll post it on YouTube. I'll send the link to you before I publicize it, etc. And then it will be connected, linked to the Center for the Study of Social Justice. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You.
I hope
Take care. Bye-bye.
We'll stay engaged. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
Take
Sarah.
care.